The adoption of the BNCC, the national standards, is a declaration of goals for the whole system. And the goals for the whole system are not just for the system as the top, but they filter down to every state, every school, every teacher, and every student. They become the goals for each student. So a large-scale assessment, the purpose of that is to see how well a Brazil educational system is moving towards these goals at every level. And the movement towards the goal has two aspects. One is direction. Is the system moving in the right direction? And the other is how far along are we getting? Is the trend from year to year, is the trend, are we moving quickly enough? Are we making progress? So these two ideas of progress and direction are intertwined. And we have to worry about both of them, because if we design the large-scale assessment poorly, we may pull the system in the wrong direction, or we may fail to detect progress where there is progress. And so the feedback from the assessment will be counterproductive instead of productive. Because we are steering the system and we want to steer it at the target, and the target is defined in the BNCC, is rich and complex, then the assessment has to have a parallel richness and complexity. One of the common mistakes is to assess something that correlates with what's important, because it's cheaper and more reliable to assess the correlate. And to give an example, an analogy, it's useful. Suppose Brazil decided to combat childhood obesity by asking the schools to run programs to combat obesity. And they decided to measure to see how progress was going. But when the first year when they set out to measure, all the scales were different. Some schools measured with shoes on, some with shoes off. There was all these irregularities in the measurement of the students' weight. And besides that, weight tended to fluctuate. Some schools weighed before lunch, some after lunch. And so this fluctuation in weight was causing error. And besides, it's expensive and time-consuming. So they decided, the measurement people decided it was cheaper, more reliable, and more and less fluctuation if you measured height. And by measuring height, they could infer weight, because height and weight correlate very highly with each other. But the people who were running the program said, no, we're not trying to change the students' height, we're trying to change their weight. You're not measuring what our goal is. And they said, well, it correlates so highly that we can be very accurate based on the correlation. And they say, well, we're trying to measure change in weight. And they did a test and saw that change in height predicted change in weight. And so they were even more sure that height was the thing to measure. And after 5 years of this sort of measurement, it was determined that there was no impact of the program on weight, because it had no impact on height. Now, that sounds like a kind of a silly fable, but in fact, it's very easy to do that in education, to measure traits that don't change in students, but will correlate with things that you want to change. So in mathematics, for example, some students are very good students. They're well organized, they study, they're very bright, and so on. And they're going to do well in mathematics. If you measure something that's true of all the students who are well organized and bright, and say it predicts their mathematics, yes, it does predict their mathematics, but you're not measuring their mathematics. You're measuring something the students have brought with them to school. You're not measuring something the school is adding value. So we want to focus on what value the school adds rather than measuring what the students bring with them to school. It's impossible to do that absolutely, but we have to do it as best we can and not give in to the temptation to measure what's easy to measure rather than measuring what's important. So in a national test, if there are state tests, it's not necessary for the national test to test every student. And in fact, most national tests don't test every student. Examinations test students because examinations are much more about the transaction. So for example, the Cambridge exams or the College Board exams, or the exams you take when you apply to college, or the exam you take to get placement in a program at the university. Those are exams, and so it's a transaction with the individual student. But a national test is a transaction with the with the teacher, the school, the state. And so that's where the transactions are. So you don't need to test every student on every item. So you will be sampling. And it's very important for the sample to be a scientifically well-designed and well-conducted sample. And in terms of making comparisons, your samples have to be adequate in size to support the inferences about those comparisons. So suppose you wanted to compare two subpopulations of students, and one you sampled adequately, but the other you didn't because it's a smaller population. So then you won't be able to compare them. So if you do want to compare them, you have to make sure there's an adequate sample of each subpopulation. So it's not just sampling the nation as a whole, it's sampling each group, each subpopulation that you want to compare. Other kind of comparison people want to make is when I look at the BNCC, there's 5 areas, and the 5 areas are broken down into to objectives and subtopics, and there's a structure to it. And I want to know, am my students doing well in one area and not so well in another area? This is much more difficult to realize from a measurement standpoint and an assessment point. You can't stop people from doing it, but it's very difficult to measure 2 different things in a way where the numbers are comparable. It's like I'm trying to measure length and weight, and I want to compare them. Well, you're comparing, 2 different things. It's not so easy to do. But I want to see how well I'm doing on these 2. Well, suppose the items I picked for geometry were easier than the items I have for algebra. How would I know? Am I doing better in geometry, or did I just accidentally use easier items? So there's a lot of difficulty with making it comparable across areas. You can help tremendously with that. Again, it's a sampling issue. Not only are we sampling students, but we're sampling items from what we're measuring. So if you imagine, in order to really see what's going on with the BNC curriculum, we would need about 10 items every day. So if we have 200 days, then that's 2,000 items. That's way too many for the test. So I'm going to sample those 2,000 items. So in order to sample them, I need to structure those items into similar topics, similar goals, similar standards. And then I need to make sure I sample each one. And I'm still going to have too many. So out of the 2,000 items, suppose I just take 1 out of the 10 from each day. Then I'm going to have 200 items. Well, 200 items will probably give you a pretty good sample of the BNCC, but it's too many for one student to take. So that's why matrix sampling is often used in national assessments. So not only do you not have to assess every student, but you don't have to have every student take every item. So you could have every student who takes the test, suppose you're going to have them do 30 items. You could have them do 15 items that are the same for everyone, and 15 items which are different in a systematic way. And in that way, you could have for each school a sample of the full 200 items. And you're making sure that each classroom gets sampled in a certain way so that the school score will mean something. And this brings up the issue of what level of reporting do we want to have in our national assessment. And it goes back to the question of state versus national. So in the US, it's the items are sampled in NAEP. I'm talking about NAEP, which is the national assessment. So they matrix sample the items and they sample the students. And the sample of students is enough so that there's a very precise score for each state. So we have state scores. And large cities can also get scores. So if a large city wants a score, then they have to oversample the city. And so there's enough students from the city to represent all the subpopulations. And then you can get a large city score. But there are no school scores. The school scores come from the state assessment. So each state has an assessment, and the state assessments have school scores and also individual student scores. So that's one way that they complement each other. So the national assessment is used to kind of compare states to each other and to see if the state standards are comparable to the national standards, if they've set the bar in a similar place. But then the state assessment is used to compare school to school and student to student. I guess the more significant and important way in which the tests kind of undermine unintended consequence is the way what students do to learn looks more like what they do when they're taking the test. So instead of designing their lesson to optimize learning, the lesson is designed to optimize performance on the test. And while we think if they learn, they'll do well on the test, people get nervous and want to take a shortcut. And they think it's more certain if we just teach them how to do well on the test instead of teaching them mathematics. And unfortunately, there are ways of becoming good at taking the test which don't involve learning the mathematics. They're just ways of getting answers on the test which don't involve learning the mathematics. So you can undermine the very reason for having the test because the test is so important. And that's why it's extremely important for the test to look like what you want going on in the classroom, even though making it look that way will make it more expensive and difficult to grade, and it won't improve the measurement aspect, but it will improve the steering aspect tremendously. So that's why I keep coming back. Worry about and invest in an assessment that steers in the direction you want it to steer. the Common Core, which was to get states to have comparable standards, the same standards. And the BNC does the same thing in Brazil. But now you need to have assessments which are equally challenging or easy. You don't want an easy test in this state and a hard test in this state. And you want the challenge of the test to be the right challenge. It's not hard just because it's tricky. It's hard because it's focused on what's important being what the BNCC says is important.